Thank you, Paul, and good to see you all. I'm Lee Rowley, I'm the MP for North East Derbyshire, and as of 2.5 weeks ago, I was appointed Minister for Industry, so please make the questions easy on me later. I want to start to Andy's point about what is the exam question that we're trying to answer. And if the exam question is, how do we want to make sure that when we're coming back from coronavirus and with a plan for growth, how we make that work for industry and for business all across the 4 nations of the UK, we have to go back to basics about what we want business and industry to do. And as a Conservative, I want businesses to thrive and to grow so they can provide the wealth which ensures that the communities in which we live in can thrive and grow as well. But what businesses tell me, and some of you were around tables that we were at earlier with some members of the business community, you're looking for, after a very, very difficult period, most extraordinary times of our lives, both personally and corporately, and for the companies and the organisations we work for, you want clarity and you want consistency and you want to know where the government wants to go, and you want the ability to be able to do the things that business do best, to get on with innovating, to get on with selling, to get on with producing, to create that private sector enterprise which boosts our country and makes sure we continue to be the engine of progress that we all want it to be. So the job of government at the moment is to accept that we have been through both a difficult time pre-coronavirus in terms of some macro challenges, whatever we think about Brexit. The reality was there was a lack of clarity at points between 2016 and 2019 until we got through that. And then, as a result of all these physical and medical challenges that we've had in the last 18 months, what we do to create that secure framework and to create that consistency so that business can go ahead and can make decisions on investment, can work out where to go, and can build back better, to use the phrase, over the course of the coming years ahead. So the whole point of the plan for growth, and the whole point why the government came out with it a number of months ago, was to do 2 things. One was to say, we have a definition of the problem. We have a set of analyses of where we think we need to do things differently in the future. Some of that is about redistributing activity and what the government does and the government's focus around the country. So some of Andy's points just a moment ago. And then secondly, on top of having that analysis about where we think we need to improve, we're trying to bring together all of the different elements of what government is doing, i.e. either pre-coronavirus or as a result of coronavirus, because there was a necessity to come out with all of the schemes which you will all be aware of. And we're trying to put a framework across that so you as business people, or people who work in businesses, or the business community as a whole, understand where we're going long term. So the whole point of the plan for growth is to try to start putting that framework from which we can build after an extremely difficult time. And hopefully over the coming months, I can't comment on the spending review as you would expect, but there will be outcomes from the spending review over the coming months when the budget occurs and when the government brings forward various policies from all the departments. We can continue. It's the framework from which we can build and move on from this very difficult period of our lives, both personally and economically. Got the right to start?
That is, Nearly. Thank you very much. And next, I'm going to ask Suzanne Webb. Very pleased that you're able to join us, who's MP for Stourbridge, elected in 2019, and is PPS to Ben Wallace. And as you all know, to say there's an industrial dimension to defence would be an understatement. Anyway, Suzanne, welcome.
No, thank you very much for having me here. Now, for me today, it's a really important conversation that we're going to have, and I want to set the scene by talking about my constituency. It's a constituency, effectively, of 2 halves. So I've got thriving businesses. I've got a fantastic aggregates business supporting HS2. It's invested in an amazing wash plant, and they recruit from the age of 16 in apprenticeships, and they're securing more contracts. It's a really fantastic business, and so their employment levels have actually surged, and they're targeting very much on youth roles and youth jobs. I've also got a freight company that also thrived through COVID, and it's thriving basically because they recruited their HGV drivers right from the start. They put them on the books, they pay them a fair wage, and they deliver loyalty in abundance. But equally, I've got unemployment, particularly for young adults, which is above the national average, and they've been greatly affected also by the impacts by COVID. And so it's really a constituency of 2 halves. So what we're talking about today is vital and important to me. Now, both these businesses I talked about also started from opportunity, an ex-armed forces personnel and an ex-lorry driver. Now, the Chancellor has rightly talked about a plan for growth and about the need to make big investments in infrastructure, innovation and skills as we level up the country. Now, for me, this will be about seeing new transport infrastructure to attract business into the region and allow people to get around work more easily. Projects like the metro extensions across the Black Country have been absolutely fantastic that we've bid for. Now, for me, it means about protecting and amplifying what makes our region economically distinctive, particularly about the supply chain and the automotive sector. And I have a wealth of firms actually in my constituency that basically have the ability to innovate and actually to grow. But to be able to do that, we need this plan for growth. And that is vitally important to me. It's about investments to support transition to electric vehicles and things like the battery gigafactory, which I'll leave somebody who is on this panel probably to talk about and mention later. I won't mention who that might be. Now, for me, to achieve all of this, we're looking more at post-16 education and employment support, and I'm a huge fan of technical levels for in this instance. But for me, it's about creating quality jobs. We need not just to attract the best talent to the region, but to create our own homegrown talent, train, skill and reward with high-quality jobs, and that's what I hope the plan for growth will actually deliver.
Thanks very much. Next, I'm going to go over to Richard Torbett, Chief Executive, Abpi. Richard, welcome.
Thanks very much, Paul. So, my name is Richard Torbett. The Abpi is the Pharmaceutical Industry's trade association in the UK, if I can get my teeth in. I'm really enthusiastic about the plan for growth and the life science vision, which sort of sits alongside it as a sort of growth strategy that we've been working very closely with government on over the last few months. The pharmaceutical industry is by quite some way the largest investor in R&D in the UK and has been for many years, and we want to see that grow even more. I'm particularly pleased about the theme of the panel and much of this conference actually about making sure that growth really reaches right around the UK. And I did actually want to pull out the West Midlands, if I may. Give you one example. We think there is real potential in particularly cities like Birmingham, where we have a very important partnership between the ABPI and Birmingham Health Partners that is already seeing dividends in that area, and we want to progress that as we sort of move forward. So I wanted to pull out a few things that we think are really important to get right if we're going to deliver for the pharmaceutical industry and the wider life science sector. First might be obvious coming from us, which is the sustained investment in science, in public science. I think Andy makes a very fair point about the balance between that science funding between London and the rest of the country, which I think needs to be looked at. There was a conscious decision a couple of decades ago to try and compete on a global basis through, I guess, disproportionate science funding in the Golden Triangle. And I think there's a real question about whether the pendulum has swung a bit too far. We know that there's a connection between science and research active universities and the quality of teaching. So I think a big question mark there for the future. Advanced manufacturing is something that I think has got a lot more potential in this country than I think many people have perhaps perceived in the past. We've seen just in the last couple of years, just in the last 18 months, of course, with the COVID vaccines, it's been a real success story for the UK, and we've had manufacturing of vaccines, all components, in towns like Livingston, Wrexham, Darlington, Durham. So we've got some really good news stories that we can build on. But I think it's also fair to say that in recent years we've also had lots of examples of where we've lost out, and we've lost out to Singapore, we've lost out to Ireland, we've lost out to Germany. So there's some very concrete steps that we could take to try and make sure we're on a level playing field. Finally, for me, I think it's really important for our sector to note that we've only got one customer, which is the National Health Service. We work very closely with the NHS, and it's really critical that the NHS is an innovation partner, that they are rapidly adopting new technologies and working with us on the research process. And the massive advantage of the NHS from a levelling up perspective, of course, is that if we get it right, every NHS hospital and every NHS patient could participate in that research effort and therefore contribute to the growth that we all want to see. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks. And I'm going to go over here to Anthony Walker, Deputy CEO of techUK.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Stretch your imaginations a little bit. Imagine last couple of years that COVID hadn't happened. Stretch your imagination a little bit further. Imagine Brexit hadn't happened. But what would we, what's the big thing that we'd all be talking about in that kind of environment in terms of some of the biggest challenges, the biggest changes that we face? And I'd argue that it's the global impact of this age of exponential technology that we're living through today, which is driving transformational change in almost every aspect of every economy, every society around the world. And we'd be much more focused, I think, on what are the implications of that, what are the real concerns about that, impact on jobs and dislocations and so on that might be associated with it, but also what are the huge opportunities for the UK to benefit. And we've got a real opportunity, I think, to shape that change or be shaped by it. So, we'd argue at techUK that this period of transformational change is one that we absolutely have to, really grab hold of and try and shape. And there's massive potential in the UK. We have extraordinary strengths in all sorts of different technologies, but not just that. We also have strengths in other areas of the economy where we can really apply technology, areas like fintech, where we can really be at the forefront of these new growth areas. So in terms of building back better, I think what's the world that we'd have been building anyway? And you've got to say that technology would absolutely be at the heart of that. Now, we did have the pandemic, and what we saw in that period was this period of very accelerated digital change and digital adoption. From large businesses to small businesses, companies kind of adapted, they pivoted to survive, and we felt great about that. I think as a country, we thought we were doing really well. I think our concern is that whilst there was lots of positive transformation, some of that was quite thin. And I think as we look forward now, we've got to think about, okay, how do we seize on that opportunity and really apply technology across the whole of the economy to really kind of push forward. And I think in doing that, I think the plan for growth itself is really pretty good. I think in many ways, from a technology perspective, it feels more appropriate for the kind of world that we're entering than the old industrial policy, old industrial strategy, which in some ways felt quite siloed. Whereas, innovation across the piece is right at the heart of this plan for growth. Infrastructure, skills, innovation, absolutely the kind of key issues there. Skills in particular, we've had the lifetime skills guarantee, lots of, I think, great focus on how we retrain, but we need to scale that up massively. I don't think there is an organisation on this panel where it wouldn't say there isn't a huge demand for digital skills. How do we open up pathways for more people to participate in that digital economy? And we think we can go further on things like boot camps and so on, where we can really bring more people into the sector, open up opportunities. But also I think in terms of regulation, we're also in a period of again globally, a new wave of regulation in terms of how do we regulate the technology, technology sector, but also some of the impacts and consequences of this rapid technological change. And we've got a real opportunity, I think, to try and find that sweet spot in getting that regulation right, where we create a framework that really enables people to innovate with confidence and that builds trust and confidence in society, but also being careful that we don't over-regulate or put new barriers in the way of innovation. And I think there's some work to do, I think, to look across the piece in terms of saying, are we getting that right across the whole piece? And then finally, I would just say kind of climate change. I think, absolutely top on the list for our sector in terms of its importance, but also in terms of its sheer opportunity for the UK. A massive opportunity to innovate, massive opportunity to drive change, and a huge growth opportunity for UK tech. So that's an area where I think we want the government to be as bold as possible in terms of driving industry towards rapid change, rapid innovation, because we think we can be a real leader there.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Ian Wright.
Paul, thank you very much. I'm Ian Wright. I'm the Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm going to use that pleasure by not agreeing with everything that everybody else has said, because that'd be really boring, wouldn't it? I've been quite a critic of the government over the last few weeks, you might have noticed, on labour shortages, and I still think that that is an area where the plan for growth needs fleshing out. But I do agree with every word that Suzanne said about skills. I think that is utterly critical. It's an utterly critical part, and I think Andy is right when he says that we have to look at the disproportionate amount of national income or spending of national income that the government does in certain areas. I would just say that the food and drink industry is the largest manufacturing sector. It's worth more than aerospace and aviation and automotive combined. It employs 500,000 people around the country, but the farm to fork food chain employs 4.1 million people. So it's utterly crucial to our national success. It's also utterly crucial to our national happiness. And it's also crucial to our security, because if you can't feed a country, you don't have a country. So we are at the sharp end of a lot of this stuff. And I do think that the levelling up agenda sits very well with the industry I represent, because there is a food and drink manufacturing plant with more than 50 people in every single parliamentary constituency in the country. I noticed you look surprised, sir. There really is, and we're very proud of that fact. But it's really important that we grip that and that we provide the same enablement to Lowestoft as we do to London. We are a national industry, and one of the dangers is that the faraway places and the unlooked for places get forgotten. So skills and the capacity for businesses to invest in things like automation and artificial intelligence, which will eventually deal with those labour shortages that I've talked about a lot recently, are absolutely critical. And the last thing I'd say, Paul, is here, nobody has mentioned this, and I wonder if anybody's mentioned it at all in the last 48, 72 hours. We're in the home of Cobden and Bright, the home of free trade. This is one of our great national traditions, and it is one of our great national assets. And we need to be able to conduct a properly free trading economy. Food can be one of the great exports of our country. It can also be, and it is really important that it is, one of the great imports of our country. Nobody wants restricted choice. And as the government considers its options, I really hope it looks very closely at its trading agenda. I've been a huge advocate and admirer of Liz Truss's work. I'm very confident that that will continue under the new regime. But it is crucially important that we look at free trade on both ways, and that we don't erect too many barriers to that, in order that part of that levelling up agenda is achieved through being what we have always been, which is a great trading nation. Paul, back to you.
Thank you very much. So we'll go over and have a discussion. Just, I can't help saying it, Ian, on that last point. We're right next to Mosley Street, and it's actually here that Cobden and his supporters, they got the legal suits going that drove out the Mosleys, who have the right to the monopoly of the Manchester market. It's an incredible story. So, Q&A. I just got one right at the start before I take two at a time. I want to start with Andy. We've got the budget coming, and then with this levelling up white paper, which was delayed. And a question that keeps occurring to me about all of the subjects we've discussed is, where are they going to be done? You know, what are we going to get out of this levelling up white paper, not only in terms of whether there are more mayors, but in terms of what mayors like you are able to do now? Is a question would be, for the government, for everyone else on this panel, can the government, can everyone else really deliver net zero or an industrial strategy or more skills from Whitehall? Obviously they can't. What more powers do you need, or would you like to see, coming out of that levelling up white paper when it emerges?
Okay, it's a great question, Paul, thank you. So the answer to the question is no, it can't all be delivered from Whitehall. I am a huge believer, I wouldn't be sitting here if I wasn't a believer in the fact that actually local leadership can complement government in terms of delivering the outcomes. So I think the white paper will talk about probably three things worth calling out. There will be a bit on what's the governance model around the country, and as you've said many times, it's unfinished business, and I think Michael Gove will want to move that forward. I think there will be a bit about deepening the powers of the existing mayoral authorities, which we will come to, and I think there will also be really interesting stuff about actually public services being delivered better in the across the country, actually, and that's the piece that we haven't tended to talk about much in terms of the levelling up debate, but it's a critical part of it. In terms of what we're asking for, simple language, we're asking for a third devolution deal for the West Midlands to sort of be the trailblazers. It doesn't have to be all agreed now, but it should be start of negotiation, and I would say there are three new things that will be in there. You've just talked about trade and investment. That is not devolved at all. It's another completely uneven playing field. The devolved nations, Scotland and Wales, have devolved cash for trade and investment. No English region has it, and it is no surprise that London has, by a country mile, the hugest part of that. So there's a whole piece there. There is definitely a piece then about what can be done in the regions to drive net zero. So whether it be around retrofitting, whether it be about driving the green economy, or whether it be about, of course, what's being done on green neighbourhoods, there's a piece there. And then the third element will be more of what we're already doing around transport, skills and housing, where we can demonstrate that we've done well already and wish to have more. So yeah, we are ready. We would even like to write some elements of the white paper. That might be a bit cheeky and beyond my status, but yeah, that is what we're hoping for. And I actually think, being blunt about it, that Michael Gove's mission will be to bring that to fruition very, very quickly.
Susan, what do you feel about all this as a West Midlands MP, but a balance between national and local?
So most definitely I would like to see a devolution deal. As a Member of Parliament, I've seen how effectively my mayor works for me and my constituents in terms of allocation of funding and money, and talking to us in terms of what we need in my constituency and other Member of Parliament's constituency. So most definitely for that, and particularly I talked about skills, and for me that's a key part of it, because I would hope then that some funding would be allocated specifically towards skilling, and skilling is key. We talk about net zero, where we're going to go with this. The key to this is getting people skilled, young adults skilled, getting them trained. They are going to be the conduits, the facilitators of that change. They're going to be the young entrepreneurs of the future, but we need to train them up to do that, and we need that money in the regions sufficiently in the right areas, enabling the young adults to actually get that ladder of opportunity. I'd also like to touch on the trade. It has to be combined with trade as well. So get the levelling up, it has to be about trade. We have to build resilience actually into our small businesses. We all know that during COVID, there was much resilience in those businesses who were exporters, and that's what we need to do. We need to ensure we get more of those trade opportunities. We've got 70 continuity agreements already. We're building up the other trade agreements. My previous role, I should add, was the Parliamentary Private Secretary for Liz Truss. So I was very privileged to see what was going on in that department, and it has been incredible. And also we need to get that export programme up and running, so those businesses out there know who to reach out to, know where to go, so they know how to export. And I think that is a potential barrier to getting people involved in exporting. And exporting builds resilience. It will help our levelling up agenda.
And just before I bring the Minister in, what do the business reps on the platform feel about having to do maybe a bit less with central government and a bit more with your local mayor?
Paul, one of the things that I was going to say, and I'm really glad you said that about regional and what Andy said about regional trade. If you look at the way in which Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland promote their food businesses, they're absolutely magnificent at it, as indeed is the Republic of Ireland with Bull Beer. England has a massive deficit because there's nobody who does it, and it's not DEFRA's fault, there's just nobody does it. And what we need, and what David Rowley in the brief period when he was food minister was beginning to pull together, was an English food promotion thing. Now I think that's going to come out of Liz's the sort of after part of the Trade and Agriculture Commission in the next few weeks. I really hope it does, because what we can't carry on with, if I can excuse because I'm an East Midlander, we can't carry on with Melton Mowbray promoting pork pies and somebody else promoting sardines and somebody else promoting this. We need a coherent English trade body for food, and that would come, I think it could come through regional devolution. Of course there's a danger of atomising, but I think there's much more likelihood of success.
Yeah, look, we're very enthusiastic about engaging with nations and regions, and because we do believe there's a really powerful local dynamic. I mean, one of the things we've been talking to Andy about is how at a sort of regional level we can understand the varying levels of what we call local digital capital, like the potential in each region, and the different areas where there's a need for investment or attention. And we've done some work kind of benchmarking that and trying to look at the different things that can be done in each region, but also crucially how the regions can work together as well and coordinate and learn from each other's experience. And we think as an industry body we've got a crucial role to play in that as well.
Richard.
I mean, a similar answer to me. We are very keen to work with regions. One of the reasons why we were so keen to strike up a partnership with Birmingham Health Partners is that we really believe that kind of the deep local relationships we can strive there give us a better understanding of what capabilities they have. We're better able to communicate with our members, and we think that can work really well. And I think also generally, policies around export promotion and inward investment attraction, I think really importantly have to have a local element to it. At the same time, it's also right to say that there are important national assets that we need to find the right way of wiring ourselves into. For sectors like our own, our genomic strategy is at the level of the UK, our national biobank, the potential of the NHS as a research environment is most attractive when we're talking about a 60 million cohort of patients that is incredibly diverse, and if used responsibly, that data could be an incredibly interesting kind of asset for the country. So it's that blend of national and regional, and I'm not exactly sure where to draw the line, and I probably don't want to stick my neck further into that debate, but we'll work with whatever is there.
Minister, were this a Westminster Hall debate, you'd have to say the equivalent of whatever the business equivalent is of, I'll take that as an early submission for the budget. Right, but what else can you say looking forward?
I mean, my answer was going to be, I'm sure you wouldn't expect me to comment on the spending review, but I think it is genuinely, I don't speak for the government on devolution, that's in the Department for Levelling Up, but it is genuinely accepted that the progress we've made on devolution over the past X number of years, the past 10 years, has been very successful. There have been fantastic mayors like Andy and his colleagues who have done fantastic and are doing fantastic things for their individual areas. Obviously, there is a white paper coming, as Andy has indicated, in the next few, in the short period to come, and that will give more information, and I think I probably have to let that run itself. I suppose the two questions I'd probably put on the table, one as a constituency MP and not speaking in my ministerial capacity, is you've obviously got a set of discussions which will be pursued by mayors such as Andy and Andy Burnham and others about the type of powers they have and the structures that they have in the future, with all of the opportunities which you will put forward as being able to make real differences for your areas. In parts of the world like mine, I represent just south of Sheffield, at the top of Derbyshire. The challenge there is trying to think about what the right structures are when there isn't necessarily that central urban area. Now, I come from quite close to Sheffield, but my part of the world isn't that keen on going in Sheffield for reasons I can bore you with in the bar later. But ultimately, we have to think about how we support those parts of the country. And the government has been clear that it believes in devolution, but it will be different types of devolution in different places, because that's the whole point of trying to make them as appropriate as they can be. And then secondly, I would just say devolution has clearly made a huge impact over the past 10 years in the political discourse, but there remains a role for government centrally, particularly with very strategic industries and particularly with sectors which are very geographically dispersed. And we should acknowledge that should be part of the conversation, because it's important. It is, particularly for key sectors and key industries, as well as the very important conversation and discussion about powers which go to individual geographies.
Okay, let's just take a couple of contributions. So who wants to come in? I'm going to go there and then there. Yeah. If you give your name and where you...
Thelma Mattock from Sutton Coldfield. A couple of questions. One, could the government have done more to persuade AstraZeneca to build their plant in Macclesfield rather than go to Ireland? And the second point is regarding the what I believe is the role of the embassy network. I think that's significantly under-resourced, and I think the Foreign Office through the embassy network and UKTI can do a lot more to bring investment into the UK, because there's only so much government spending or government money that can be allocated throughout the UK. So that's my other point. Thank you.
Okay, and
Thank you. So I'm Philip White, I'm the Deputy Leader of Staffordshire County Council. So I was interested in the panel's views on, in addition to infrastructure, innovation and skills, which I think we can all agree are essential elements of the plan for growth and levelling up. What's the place of business startups and actually growing the number of businesses? Because I'm rather a fan of letting 1,000 flowers bloom rather than trying to pick the one or two that we think are going to be the big successes. And I'll just give a small example. In Staffordshire, we've got a programme called Ignite, where we actually teach 16-year-olds entrepreneurial skills. And with the best ones, if they've got good business ideas, we'll actually help them take those into the real world at 16. So what's the place of that in this conversation at this stage? Because at the moment it seems to be a reasonably quiet part. Thank you.
right, Ian, I'm going to start with you because you specifically mentioned investment into Ireland, didn't you?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think Jerry Grimston is doing quite a good job, actually, at trying to encourage investment, but we're not absolutely spectacular at it at the small scale. We're pretty good at the really big stuff, Nissan and some of these other successes. And, you know, when you get a Prime Minister or a Chancellor involved, you've got a good chance. I can't comment on the Macclesfield thing, I'm afraid. Richard's definitely the man for that. Drop you right in it. But the other thing I would say to the Maoist from Staffordshire, if I may say so, Mao, Cobden and Bright, we'll get there with a series of decent historical figures, Paul, including yourself. But we are actually quite good at that startup thing, and I think the Chancellor may have happened by mistake on another one. This thing where he's taken stakes in the businesses that couldn't afford to repay some of the loans, I think that's brilliant. And I actually think the government should be doing that much more. We were advocating that from the start. We said you shouldn't be expecting some of these businesses to pay it back. You should expect the businesses I would say there would be a cap on the amount. I wouldn't take more than 25% of any business. I think that's too much of a risk for the government. But I think you need to have it over quite a long term. Food businesses would be a very good place to do that because they're quite low cost start, but for the individuals concerned, they carry a big risk. I think that is the way to go, and I certainly think if government thinks about that more, and then also thinks about how you invest in those businesses and create the space in the P&L, in the balance sheet, for them to do investment in AI and automation, then I think you're cooking with gas, actually.
Startups.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think actually the UK has got a fantastic story to tell in terms of tech startups. I mean, we're far in advance, the lead country in Europe for technology startups, and not far, behind some, parts of the US as well. And actually what we've had real success in over the last few years is starting to scale some of those companies as well. So again, we lead the rest of Europe by miles in terms of the number of so-called unicorn companies, companies with billion-dollar valuations. I slightly worry that the number of new startups is starting to tail off a little bit. So I do think it needs to remain a focus of attention. But there's no doubt at all in my mind that combination of sort of entrepreneurship that we have in the UK plus tech expertise and tech skills is very powerful in terms of generating new companies.
Richard, what was that about Macclesfield?
Yeah, so I also can't comment on the specifics of Macclesfield. However, what I can comment about is we've done some really extensive work in looking at what makes the UK competitive or not when it comes to attracting large companies. And to just make the connection with the startup conversation, startups are obviously incredibly important, but I also think it's incredibly important not to lose sight of the importance of very large companies and their role in economic systems, because very large companies, there aren't only so many of them, but when we've got them, they tend to stay here for a long time, and they tend to create lots of oxygen around which much other economic activity can thrive. And so it's a real blend between the two. What we've noticed is that investment in life sciences has always been incredibly competitive. It won't surprise anyone to know that particularly since COVID, that level of international competition for life science investment has gone up several gears, which means that other countries are really going the extra mile to get over the line, to get investment decisions over the line. And when we've compared ourselves, we've compared UK policies to countries like Ireland or Singapore or Germany, we are not quite there. We're not at that level playing field, which was the phrase of the moment not so long ago, talking about a level playing field. We're not at a level playing field right now. 2 examples of how we could get there. We could have a sensible programme of capital grants, which we would describe as a no-win, no-fee policy, because if we don't get the investment, the Treasury doesn't have to pay anything. But if it does, then you've got major investment, you've got large companies that will stay here for a long time. And that just needs to be at the same level of competitiveness as these other countries. The second thing is we've got a brilliant R&D tax credit in this country, but it needs to be modernised. We need to have capital included in there. That will help manufacturers, it will help the levelling up agenda, and we need to have cloud computing in there as well, because that's not currently, cloud computing is central to so much R&D at the moment. You can't claim your tax credit against cloud computing. So those are 2 examples of what we could do.
Suzanne, Andy, what?
Just for me, in terms of investment, we've just got to make the conditions beneficent to do that. So it is about the competitive edge. We've got to do that. Again, it's what I talked about before, about building resilience into our businesses. Again, it's about skills, because we've got to provide those high quality people to be able to fulfill those jobs. And it's also, when you talk about startups, it's about the evangelism of entrepreneurialism. And basically, we need to be seen to be encouraging it. And it's talking, about what we do trading locally as well. So I think if we set the scene and we sort of create a condition that has all that makes us all incredibly attractive for investment in the area. And I completely agree in regards to research and development, and particularly around the cloud area as well.
I'll just add one thing, because a lot of sense has been spoken on the panel. Our problem is not startups, it's scale-ups, as Anthony said. So that's where I do think there's a really interesting public policy debate about what is the role of the public sector in terms of providing that scale-up support. And to use your words, maybe the Chancellor also happened on something in COVID where he talked about these programmes using our best universities to provide that sort of, it was part of his plan for growth, that programme there. Just one other nudge. The unicorn success story that we heard about is a London story. It is another example of where the country is very unequal. We only have 2 in the West Midlands, which, by the way, are both in the most prosperous part of the West Midlands. So we are not achieving it across the country, and so you ask yourself what needs to happen to get the London success in the rest of the country. And a lot of the stuff that, to be fair to Anthony, he and his team are working on about the conditions for those startups to grow into scale-ups and then into unicorns. We've got a lot of work to do to get that across the whole country.
Minister.
Well, you probably would expect me to be a bit of a travelling salesman for how successful the UK has been. We should definitely bid, and we should definitely go after all of these big investments. We're not, in all practical sense, going to get everything, but I think we have a pretty good track record. I mean, just in the last few weeks, we've seen announcements on pharma. We've had some good announcements out of the automotive industry over the last few months in terms of EVs, electric vehicles, and things like that. I went to see Airbus a few days ago in Broughton, and they're doing some fantastic things in innovating on the wing of tomorrow and those kind of things. In my constituency in North East Derbyshire, combined in Scotland, there is a Spanish rail company that is coming to build a factory in Scotland, an innovation centre in my part of the world. So we have a great track record to be proud of. We should want to build on that. We should want to make it even better. But I think sometimes we don't recognise how successful we are being, and we should not rest on any laurels, but recognise the success of what we achieve. And then, just on your second point, just before I conclude, you are absolutely right. There is only so much money, and the job of government is infinite demands on finite resource. So the question is how we allocate it. And what I think, for any of you in the audience in the auditorium when Kwasi was speaking, and the Secretary of State when Base Secretary of State was speaking today, he is very clear about the job of BEIS is to leverage private sector capital. So it is what the government can provide in order to multiply so that it works for the country as a whole. And if we can do that, we can unlock both the investment from the public sector side, from the government side, but then also augment it from a private sector side. And if we can do that, that should help us to move forward.
Great. So there's one over there and one. Anyone else? Oh, Andrew also, yeah. So.
Thank you. Mike Leonard from the Building Alliance. Themes that I've heard constantly through this conference have been skills, levelling up, climate change and housing. A common denominator of all those things, of course, is building products and building product manufacture. we manufacture 90% of what goes into a home, for instance, in the UK at the moment. But I rarely hear it talked about when we talk about our manufacturing platform. And where we're seeing really big investments in the Midlands, for instance, two state-of-the-art brick factories being built, at a cost of hundreds of millions, no subsidy from government. Can I ask that we think about, as a panel, the importance of broadly thinking about our industrial base, and particularly the things that are going to contribute to the growth that we've got in the coming years? Thank you.
Andrew Rowley of The Observer. I've been around long enough to see various governments make fitful attempts at devolution, which is at the heart of making levelling up a success or not, both New Labour and Conservative. And in the end, England, Scotland, Wales are different issues now, but England remains the most centralised country in Western Europe. And I'm going to give you a trivial but I think telling example from this very conference. One of the big announcements at the beginning of the conference was £22 million extra for tennis courts. We know why that happened, because the Prime Minister likes playing tennis, because we have a new global superstar at tennis, and because the relevant minister had to put something in a press release. Now, there will be bits of the country where they don't want to spend money on tennis courts, and if it wasn't a centrally distributed pot, they might spend it on improving rugby league facilities, perhaps, in parts of Northern England. And although that may seem a trivial example, doesn't it go to the heart of it that instinctively ministers will not, in the end, do the massive transfer of power and money, both the ability to raise money and spend it, to people like Andy, to make devolution really, really serious?
All right, Andy. I mean, tennis courts.
Do you think I better answer that?
What do you think?
Decided yourself.
I suspect there aren't going to be many additional tennis courts in the inner city of Birmingham. No. Is the truthful answer, Andrew? And you can make of that what you want. Okay, but behind that example, there's a very serious point. We are at a sort of Rubicon moment on this, aren't we? We've been talking about devolution for a number of years, and as Lee said, I do think we've made some good moves, and we have secured a lot of cash through having our combined authority model, £4 billion over the last few years. That's not trivial, actually, and that has genuinely been brought in through our new model. But to the heart of your question, are they prepared to devolve what Michael Heseltine called a single pot? So the decisions on how it is spent is actually taken by the local people rather than the cash has flown. And I have to say, Philip Hammond was an absolute believer in sending the cash, but the decisions tended still to be taken centrally. The next Rubicon is the decision going to be devolved? Now, there is a very promising sign, Andrew. The government announced back in the March budget what was called then the Intercity Transport Fund, and it's now been given the sexy title City Region Sustainable Transport Settlement. I can hardly say it. Crusts. But that is the first single pot. It's £4.2 billion between the mayoral combined authority areas. We're bidding in for the total sum. There's an interesting question about whether we should be bidding against one another. Does that bring the right behaviour forward? Personally, I'm up for it, because you actually look at the quality of your bid. But then it will be devolved for local decision making. And if that is the sign of change to come, we're just beginning to cross that Rubicon. The next Rubicon, by the way, which I should be very brief on, is whether we are going to devolve tax raising powers, because at the moment only 6% of taxes are raised and kept locally. I think that might be a little too far for this round, but it will actually be the real test of whether true devolution is coming, and I am going to continue to bat for that being the case.
Anyone else on? I mean, not pick people off individually. Ask anyone else who want to come in on any of the questions being asked, whether it was building products or tennis courts. Anyone?
Coming back to our analysis of looking regionally at the strengths and weaknesses in relation to digital, what we see is absolutely the problems around the country are different, and there are some areas of the country that have got that are really strong on skills or on infrastructure, but they've got weaknesses elsewhere, and that ability to be able to recognise where the gap is and focus on it, and invest in it and have that freedom to do that, would definitely be helpful from when we look at it, which is quite a way removed from those big questions.
Paul, I'll have a go at the Rawnsley conundrum. I mean, the first thing is, of course, ministers have just spent their entire careers getting to Whitehall. So why would they give the bloody thing away? I mean, for God's sake, oh, you're an idiot, man. But I think the serious point, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the problems with Andy's very apparently sensible sounding solution is, if you've got a mayor, you're in a better position than if you haven't got a mayor. So if, like me, you live in the East Midlands, we haven't got a mayor. And so it's much easier for Andy to bid for that money than it is for a conglomeration of Nottingham, Leicester and Rutland to bid for that. The second point I make is just a word of warning, but I am, incidentally, Andy, totally supportive of what you say. And I would answer your question in the affirmative. I think we should do what you're suggesting, or what's implicit in your question. The other problem is it does make it quite difficult for business to know exactly what it should be doing as there is a changing landscape. And one of the interesting things about the COVID crisis was the disparity between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland in terms of regulation, and that caused an enormous amount of buggeration for quite a lot of businesses, particularly as between Scotland and the rest, where they had much more pernicious, if I can put it that way, restrictions. And it did mean that businesses took decisions to change production patterns so that they could do it where there was more predictability. So if you could get around that, Paul, I think you would have a reasonable answer to that question.
Minister, you were coming in.
Yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge the point about building product manufacturers. I mean, I am the new construction minister, so it would be remiss of me not to do so in the first instance. But also, you are absolutely right to point out the importance of the supply chain and about the importance of the value chain end to end. You know, you can't build the bricks unless you know where you get the materials from in order to build the houses in the first place. So I would welcome further conversations with you and your colleagues separately to talk about that, because it's vitally important. But then to Andrew's point about devolution, and I just want to point out, I think, one thing which I think is not in my department, not in the department I'm in, but look at the town deals, which have been going now for a year and a half. I've got 2 in my part of the world. They are good examples, 100 of them, I think it's 101 that are out there at the moment, in areas which perhaps have not had the kind of support that other parts of the world, like big cities, have done over the past 10 years. They are real devolution of both money and decisions. You are signing off high-level things with the department, but then you are in charge of the delivery, and you have to bring together a group of business people, and a group of council people, and others to try and work that through. So there are examples of where devolution is starting to bring together that capacity across the country, including in parts of the country where it perhaps haven't done historically, which will allow things to hopefully build on that in the coming months and years ahead.
Just to come in on that. In terms of devolution, I talked about it earlier in terms of the skills and so forth. And some may say I would say this anyway, but what's really, really important in all of this is having the right person with the right motivation. And thankfully, we've got that in the urban West Midlands. We've got the right mayor with the right motivation, who understands the complexity of the region and the importance of coming out of COVID and what we need to do. And that's when it really works. And so some form of devolution, moving on, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of skills, will be very much welcomed, because it's going to be in the right hands of the right person with the right motivation.
Okay, next to one there. Anyone else? Yeah, just if you can. Yeah.
Hello, it's Lorraine Northway from Staffordshire. Just to say, Levelling Up really started with HS2, and obviously that is going to be a major player. We talk a lot about passenger transport, but this is actually going to get goods around not just our country, but to the free ports to export and to bring components in. And obviously, would the panel agree that by having this major area covered, it's actually going to open up endless opportunities to endless people? It might not directly be on the HS2 line, but companies can do very well. I'd like, for example, the gigafactory that we're hoping to get in Coventry. I'm sure a little company called JCB that's in Staffordshire will be very interested in their batteries that they'll be making, because I'm sure that they'll want a bit of a partnership. And so that sort of thing about how you actually link people back together, and it's going to be both nationally and internationally bringing components in and getting really good products out.
Yeah, and that, yeah.
I am chairman of a Conservative Association in a rural area, which we can fit Greater Manchester into. And we've just been awarded a very large defence contract for the first half mile of the area, but the rest of the 19-20 miles or so of the constituency is rural. And we produce food, we produce cheese, beer, gin. I'm delighted that we're having the defence contract, the cyber event in Lancashire is slap bang at the edge of our patch, but I'm really concerned about the implications for the small market towns and for the rural economy of the rest of my patch.
Which is where?
Sorry, Ribble Valley.
Ribble Valley, right.
So I'm looking at building up for UK industry and business. I'm thinking, wow, where am I in here? We might be the food capital of Great Britain or of England, but it's looking a bit serious now.
Right, okay. Who wants to...
Well, to the comment on HS2, yes, that's my answer to that one. But just in a bit more detail, I mean, for me... Sorry? Well, so in terms of HS2, it's a major player for me in my constituency, and it's for my supply chain businesses, my small supply chain businesses, high quality metals, steels, small components, the manufacturing. So it's not just building a train line, it's the knock-on effect of that is going to have for my businesses. And when I talked earlier about my aggregates business, that is a winner from HS2. It is expanding at a rate of knots. This huge wash plant is costing millions to put in, so you can actually understand the revenue they're going to generate from actually having procurement opportunities with HS2. So for me, it's an absolute yes onto HS2. I haven't got the answers to your point, so I will skip on those and leave it to others to best answer.
Anyone else?
Can I just comment just on the kind of the small towns point? I mean, I grew up in a small market town in Northumberland, and I'm well aware of the challenges that places like that face today. But actually, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about is the effect of the pandemic and the shift towards more home working and different working patterns and the implications for cities in that, but also the opportunities, I think, for more rural parts of the economy. With what we certainly see in the tech sector is, people really can work from anywhere. So, you can have a very high value job that where somebody could be living in one of your towns or villages. And so how does that start to change the kind of local economics? But I think that means, focus on how do you make these places kind of attractive in the first place. But also then how do you start to build those communities and build around a change in the sort of demographics that I think you will see that, will be maintained kind of post-pandemic. So I do think, I don't think everybody's going to be working from home forever, God forbid, but I do think we're into a different kind of working pattern and working arrangement that has benefits for rural areas.
Can I just offer one thought, Paul? And, this is slightly provocative and some people disagree with me, but, we need to be a bit provocative at these occasions. The deficiency in the UK's economic performance is not about the affluent counties. It is about the performance of our core cities outside London. They are all under-punching their weight hugely compared to our French, German and American colleagues. And we've got to ask why that is. There are lots of answers to it. The connectivity to the question asked there is part of it, both between them and within it, and also all the stuff, we won't go over it all again, about the skills, the network for encouraging innovation, though that is the deficiency in the UK's economic performance. It is not, frankly, the performance of the affluent counties.
Can I just come back on HS2, which is probably a dangerous thing for ministers to come back on, but anyway, I'm gonna do it. I think the answer, by the way, sir, to your question is probably the restoring your railway fund, because we've tried that in our part of the world, and it's hopefully bringing back rail services that were cancelled 50 years ago with beaching. But on HS2, I think there will be differences of views in this room and within this conference and without about HS2. But I think the thing as a Conservative that I always go back to is we are not levelling up, we're not doing HS2, we're not implementing policies as ends in themselves. They are means to ends. And HS2 is a means to an end. It's to improve the connectivity that Andy was talking about, is to unlock economic opportunity in the regions. When we talk about it in the East Midlands, where we are still having the debate about what happens, the reality is, if we don't do something on rail in the next 20 years, we will probably run out of capacity on rail. So all the discussions historic for the last 10 years about HS2, about whether or not it shaves X amount of time off it or not, it's slightly irrelevant, because we're trying to answer a question about capacity, not about what we talk about in the usual conversation about HS2. So as Conservatives, if we focus more on the outputs than the process, I think that probably ensures that we deliver what we need to.
Who else? No? No? Okay, is there a last question? I have one if there's not a last question, because on the one hand we have to get out of here in a moment. On the other, I don't want to force you all out into the rain. Having made the decision when I left the hotel, I'm not going to need a raincoat for this one. My question is this, right? We went to interview Kwasi Kwarteng last week, and naturally I asked Kwasi about the petrol queues and said, is there a struggle going on between the road haulage business trying to force you back to a pre-Brexit way of doing things, and the government aiming for lower migration and higher wages? And Kwasi said, yep, you've got it in one, that's what's going on. And actually the background to the conference was SAC. So I just wanted to ask particularly the kind of business people on the panel. We've spoken about skills and infrastructure and investment and new industries and so on. Are you worried about all this agenda getting lost in a quite sort of simplistic battle maybe between the two main parties over migration and wages? And just as a rider, if we are going to have to skill people up, just how long is that going to take, right? Because it can't be done overnight. So anyone on any of that?
I mean, if I could maybe offer a comment on the wage side of things rather than the migration side of things. And I think it's true to say that most sectors are really concerned about how many inflationary pressures there are in the economy at the moment, and there's an obvious incentive on governments at some level to want a bit more inflation around, because it's the easiest possible way of inflating yourself out of the debt problem. And fundamentally, if that gets out of control, it would be a real challenge for us. So I just wanted to make that comment that I think being a bit cavalier on wage inflation would be a worry long term.
Well, Ian, you said you've been a bit critical of the government in the last few days, so anything to add?
Well, just of all, before I say anything, I want more trains for Clitheroe. But I think, look, we've been very critical of some parts of this. If there really is a cunning plan that is about the transition from a low-wage, low-skill economy to a high-wage, high-skill economy, which against which the background of the immigration policy is set, that is absolutely fine, but the government needs to tell us where the tension points are going to be dealt with and when the pinch points arrive. So the reason there was a fuel shortage in the last 3 weeks is perfectly straightforward. 8 weeks ago, the Tesco and the 4 major food distributors jacked up the wages or the contract price for hauliers. And 400 hauliers moved from BP and the other petrol distribution companies to work for the supermarkets. That's why there's a petrol shortage, because they lost 400 drivers and BP wouldn't pay the wages. Now, that is one of the pinch points, and government has to think through how it will deal with those pinch points. If it can, and if it does, and if we can all know how we'll deal with that, then we'll be fine with this transition. There will be bumps. In our industry, we are never going to run out of food, big red letters, double underline. We're never going to run out of food. But what will happen is that choice will be constrained. Now, so far, actually, Paul, the British public seems, that's been going on since Easter, and the public seems okay with that. They don't think it's great, but they don't think it's so bad that they're going to rush out and buy stuff, denude the shelves. So maybe that is the solution, but we just need to do this consciously instead of sleepwalking into all of this, or possibly post hoc rationalising what we've done.
Look, we've had a skills shortage for years. It predates COVID, it predates Brexit, and it's not because we're not generating lots of really good, talented people in the UK. It's just that we're not generating enough to meet the demand that is growing almost exponentially. So the only way for the UK economy, but I'd argue for the only way for economies around the world, is to retrain and reskill your own population. And I think the technology sector has, over the last few years, has really got that. I think there's far more emphasis on retraining, reskilling now than there was certainly kind of 5 years ago. But I don't think yet we're confident that we know how to do it at the pace and scale that we need to. We're very excited about boot camps as a way of being able to bring people into the sector quickly and open up new routes for people, open up opportunities in the sector that didn't exist for many people. But we need to do it at a bigger scale, and we also need to get far better at signposting those opportunities. I think that one of the biggest challenges for people today is understanding where are the jobs of the future, and what is the route that how do I get from where I am today to where I need to be? And I think collectively, working with government, but with businesses, and not just tech businesses, the demand for digital skills is right across the economy. I think we can address it, but we really need to focus hard on that question, I think.
Susan.
So for me, very much about retraining and reskilling, but it's all about sustainable skills as well. And I've spent 29 years in the logistics and haulage business, and this HGV stuff has really been incredibly frustrating because I've seen it firsthand. It's basically those logistics companies in the first instance were reliant on agency drivers. It was basically low pay, often it's from immigration coming in and having those jobs. And that's why we were presented, and we are still presented with that problem. And so for me, again, I used the example at the beginning when I spoke at the start about a freight company in my constituency. That freight company is an incredibly £1 million business. He employs his drivers onto his books. He pays an excellent wage. He skills them, he trains them, and they are loyal to his business. That's how to do it. It's about giving the training, it's giving the entrepreneurship to them to be able to facilitate their own career and their own career path and their own aspiration of where they want to go. And with HGV drivers, do not forget, their career path is not just driving lorries, it's actually being a manager, a planning manager, actually in an RDC or in an operation. It's anything they want to be. They can move into the big logistics environment. So when we talk about this and the training and the skilling for HGVs, it's not just about being a lorry driver, it's about the opportunities for them thereon and what they can enjoy in a haulage and logistics environment.
Thank you. Andy.
Yeah, so we love talking about politics here, but actually this is economics, and I'm afraid it's destined. Doesn't matter what we all say, it's very straightforward. For years in this country, real wages didn't go up, even though we were at near full employment. And we would have a conversation like this and say, what's going on? And lo and behold, the answer was, there was immigration. Very straightforward. The British people chose to turn off the immigration tap. It is night follows day, I'm afraid, that balance that we had for many years has changed. So what is going to happen is there is going to be wage inflation. Quite how much, we don't know, because it depends on some of the other factors that have changed as well. So people's attitude to work has changed in the pandemic, so it's not just the Brexit effect, it's the pandemic. And then there have been some short-term jolts as well that we're seeing some of them played out. But those short-term jolts will disappear. What won't disappear is the fundamental of the economics. Now, the really interesting question is that good or bad for business? Because they will have put up their prices. Will they be able to sustain it? Because we'll be wealthier to be able to purchase the products from those companies. And of course, how does that leave us in terms of international competition? And my hunch is we are going to see higher labour inflation. Domestic companies will deal with it, but those exposed to foreign markets will find a tough position, and that's why the pound's already falling. And I'm afraid it is actually clear what is going to happen economically, whatever anybody says.
And also at the end of all that chain, Andy, comes the question of higher interest rates.
Of course.
Right? That's the...
Exactly.
Minister, last word lies with you.
Well, there's some very profound questions here, and we touched on some of them. I would just say a couple of things. I mean, I'm not trying to refight the Brexit wars, but the reality on Brexit was that Brexit was a change moment. Now, we're not talking about change for change's sake or change for destructive sake or anything of that nature, but it was a change moment, and I think most people on this panel have acknowledged it tonight, and I think it is important that we do acknowledge it. And Kwasi, when he speaks, he talks of an anecdote which he highlights 2 weeks before the Brexit referendum, he walked out of Staines Station, his constituency. A guy came up to him and said, I am a builder and I am voting for Brexit. And he said, why? And he said, because I have not had a wage rise in 15 years. And we have to accept that on our social contract, these things meld together. And politics is about responding to what people think. And, I'll probably... there's a much longer conversation there. But the other 2 points I would just very quickly make is we have seen in the past 2 weeks how when we're going to have challenges which we need to work through as a country. The way in which we need to do that is in a careful and a cautious way. We need to understand the problem we are facing, not what certain commentators in the media would like us to face, which was the challenge with the fuel crisis a number of days ago. And we need a much more careful conversation than we have had. And then we need to properly understand and analyse the reason these problems have been created, because the top lines often do not align with when you get under the skin of them about what the actual issues are.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you all very much, particularly for talking just long enough for the rain to stop. It's been a really great synoptic discussion. So to all of you, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.